Oh, I'd like to welcome everybody to the KSA forum webinar today. I'd like to thank Ian Holder from Bain Simmons for the presentation that he's going to do. During the, if you've got any questions during it, please use the Q&A button down at the bottom. Or if you've got any feedback, use the chat at the end, or anything else you want to raise at the end. Again, Ian, thank you for doing the presentation, and look forward to going through this with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. To see you, but I know there's lots of you watching this webinar, so a very warm welcome to you. My name is Ian Holder, as Lee has already said. I'm Managing Director of a company called Bain Simmons, based in the UK, but we are a global business doing work all over the world, including in the Kingdom as well. And our business is primarily concerned with aviation safety, although we work in other areas as well, and we are a training and consulting business. And a large part of what we talk about is how do you drive a safety culture improvement program, and this is something we have done with some of the largest aviation brands globally, and also in maritime and some other areas as well. So hopefully there will be something in this presentation that is of use to you and all of your different organizations. As already been said, I am monitoring the Q&A and the chat all the way through, and I really do welcome your comments as we go through the presentation. I will try and answer things as they come up. I also understand that you can put your hands up if you want to come and ask a question verbally. Please at any point do that. I know the IRSM team are watching that and will be able to put your microphone on for you and get involved. But really, this is a two-way conversation. So let's think about how do we drive safety cultural improvement? Well, that's an enormous topic. And of course, we have an hour together. So I'm not going to try and cover every aspect of what is a safety culture. As long as the slides will drive. But I want to really talk about this part. How do we move a culture from a blame culture to a learning culture? And let's start by talking about a couple of events that have happened in the past to try and demonstrate why we might want to do that in the first place. So you can see on the slide here, someone carrying out a medical procedure. And a number of years ago, there was a junior doctor here in the UK, a very smart and promising junior doctor who had to carry out a procedure on a 16-year-old child. And that involved giving them 2 injections. One injection was meant to be intravenous, straight into a vein, and the other one directly into the spine. They were handed 2 syringes. Those syringes were identical. Unfortunately, they used the syringes the wrong way around, and the child died. As a result of that, the doctor in question was prosecuted and was found guilty of manslaughter. Of course, while all this legal process was going on, exactly the same event happened in another hospital and another person died. So through all of that legal process of finding someone to blame, we didn't actually solve the problem, and we didn't stop it happening somewhere else and someone else dying from the same problem. The root cause of the problem being the syringes were identical. It was very difficult to determine which syringe to put where. Another example from my industry, and my background is as a pilot and as a safety director in an airline before I came into this role. Here looking at a United Airlines event that happened in the early 70s. Now, this particular crew were faced with a very difficult problem as they approached their destination airfield, in that they couldn't get the landing gear into a safe configuration. And had they have landed in that configuration, there was high likelihood of the aircraft leaving the runway. So they had a difficult problem to try and sort out this landing gear issue. Whilst they were doing that, they were distracted by the issue and missed the fact that they were running out of fuel. And in fact, in the end, did run out of fuel. Now, it's worth saying that everybody in aviation, even all of these sort of 50 years later, recognized that the pilot of that aircraft did an outstanding job having run out of fuel, because there were just 10 deaths out of an aircraft of 150 when the aircraft came down in trees. That said, of course, the crew did run out of fuel, for which there was a 7-year legal battle raged over that, about whether or not the pilot was or not to blame for it. It crushed the particular pilot. He lost his license. He almost committed suicide, and by all accounts, died a broken person. Meanwhile, of course, we haven't fixed the problem, which is actually at this point in time, there's no attention getter to the crew if you're running out of fuel. I'm sure most of you in your cars, when you're getting low on fuel, your car goes ping, and it tells you that you're low on fuel and how many miles you've got left. At this point, aircraft didn't do that. So there was nothing to remind the crew to get their heads back into their fuel. So just two events where we have blamed people and felt quite comfortable in blaming people, but of course we haven't solved the event. And indeed, at this point in time, numerous other aircraft ran out of fuel with various degrees of success on landing. So what are we going to do different? Well, we need to analyze and look at our culture. But before we talk about culture, but what do we actually mean by culture? Well, here's a very long-winded, wordy description of culture, and it talks about a group, accumulated learning, how it works, a shared adaptation, so a shared set of values and beliefs about how you actually go about doing things. Too wordy, that is. I think of it like this. Culture of an organization is how things are done. Now, that may or may not be in accordance with the procedures. It may or may not be to immediately jump to blame when something goes wrong. It is just the accepted norms of behavior in that organization. Another way of thinking about why do people behave the way they behave? Well, they behave depending on what the leaders in the organization pay attention to and measure. That will drive how staff behave. Let me perhaps give you a real world example. I once went into a very large aircraft maintenance facility. It had more than 10 bays for wide-bodied aircraft, and aircraft were coming and going all of the time. That particular facility had a number of issues where procedures hadn't been followed properly, and aircraft had gone out either with faults in them or in one case with a loose tool in it, which got dropped onto a runway, which is in aviation, a very serious event. And for those that remember the Air France Concorde accident, that was exactly what caused that accident, a tool being dropped onto the runway from another aircraft. So quite a serious failing. The CEO and accountable person for that organization couldn't understand why it was happening. And actually, they were very clear to all of their staff that they expected them to follow the procedures. So we were invited in to come and do a diagnostic of why things weren't working and to do a study of them and to write a report. And that involved us having 3 people on site for a week. Within hours of arriving on site, we had the answer to our question because we observed their morning briefing. And at that morning briefing, the CEO, as he said, re-emphasized to all of his management team that his expectation was that everybody would do things in accordance with the procedures. He immediately followed that, though, with a congratulations to many of the teams who on the previous day had managed to achieve 130% of their planned output. Now, in aviation terms, your planned output is defined by how long the manufacturer believes that each individual task in maintenance takes to complete. So the only way to have achieved 130% of planned output was to cut corners and not follow the procedures. So whilst the CEO was saying one thing, he was actually measuring and rewarding something entirely different, which was to increase your output over and above what the procedures said you would be able to achieve. And so the people on the shop floor and his management team were telling their staff, yes, I know the boss says follow the procedures, but it's not really what he wants. What he really wants is that high output, and that's what's going to be rewarded. And that was the answer to the question. You can't simply say follow the procedures and then reward the behaviors that don't follow the procedures. The challenge with a culture, though, and in that particular organization, there was a widespread culture of not following procedures because that's what they believed the boss actually wanted. The problem with a culture is you can't see the culture that you're in, because our culture is our lived normality, and the culture that we're in, we believe to be the right way of doing things. I look back in my own career, and I used to be extremely proud of an aircraft fleet that I was a member of, who we had a culture of finding a way of solving problems, and we were proud of that. What that often meant was doing things way outside of the procedures and way outside of the risk envelope that actually our seniors and our leaders expected us to. The problem was, of course, when we did and it went right, we were rewarded for it. And indeed, there are a couple of instances that I look back on now that I was congratulated for at the time for employing a novel way of doing things that I realized incurred quite considerable risk. And had it have gone wrong, people would have lost their lives. It would have been a very different story if that had happened. But of course, at the time, I could see no wrong in it because it was my lived normality. It was how everybody else around me behaved, and we were really proud of it. So that's one of the issues with culture, is we can't necessarily see our own culture. So here at Bain Simmons, we look for ways in which we can actually define safety culture and how we measure it. So we have a tool, and sitting behind this is a measurement program that looks at various things. It looks things in the middle there are your management system. The things around the outside are your enablers that make that work. And a huge part of that is having a proactive safety culture. And we can further dig down into that, into its component parts. I'm going to explain most of this evening's session will be around what is a just culture, which sits at the heart of a safety culture. And certainly in aviation and coming into maritime and other areas, it is a regulatory requirement to demonstrate that you have a just culture. So we'll explore what that means. But you also need people to feel compelled to report things, not just safe to report things, which is what a just culture gives you, but actually they understand the value of reporting things that don't go to plan or things that might not have gone to plan. Ultimately, that will lead to a learning culture so that we don't repeat the errors of the past, and that actually we do move forward and we reduce output failures. Also in there, which I'm not going to talk about in depth this evening, is a flexible culture and a questioning culture. So that ability to question why we do things the way we do things, and the ability to be able to change rather than just do things because that's the way we've always done it. But for the rest of this session, I'm really going to focus on what is a just culture. So a just culture, really the first definition of this was given to us by Professor James Reason. Many of you may have heard of Professor Reason or read some of his books, really considered to be the father figure of modern safety management. And he wrote this, and this largely still stands up today. So he talks about a just culture being an atmosphere of trust. People are encouraged, even rewarded, for providing safety information, but where they're clear about where the line must be drawn between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And it recognizes that there's differences made by errors made through the natural limitations of humans. We are not perfect human beings. We're far from perfect. We're actually remarkable. Our ability to make decisions, to reason, is really almost unrepeated in the animal world, although many would argue that dolphins apparently have more neural activity happening than humans, so some argue dolphins might be better than us in some ways, but obviously they are physically rather more limited than humans. But we are remarkable. Our big challenge, though, is we evolved to deal with a certain environment that we lived in, and actually we had to hunt food and avoid being eaten by predators that were further up the food chain to us. And that has really defined the human physiology. The problem, of course, is that we in the last 100 years have had a remarkable technological advancement, and the human isn't really designed to live in the world that we now find ourselves in. And so we are prone to numerous ways of making errors, and we'll explore some of that this evening. But of course, there are some behaviors. For example, it says here willful intent. I don't really like that expression because all intent is willful, but certainly reckless behavior, sabotage behavior, and some others that we'll explore, we certainly don't want people to do. We want people to do things the right way the first time, but we accept that sometimes for various reasons, humans make errors, they make mistakes, and sometimes they don't follow the rules. And whilst it's tempting to blame them for that, depends what culture you have as to whether or not actually blame for the individual or look at changing the culture of the entire organization, therefore looking at leadership is really the solution. Professor Reason went on to say that the purpose is to encourage open and honest reporting so that you learn and don't repeat mistakes of the past. I would add to that, it's also to make sure that you have a culture that is what you and the leadership in an organization actually desire. So for example, if you are in a heavily regulated industry like aviation, you really want a culture of people being compliant with procedures and not looking for workarounds, and people being able to say stop when they don't have the right equipment, tool, time to do the job properly, and to make sure that the organization is resourced to do that, because the output failures can be extraordinarily expensive. And I think we've seen some recent examples of that in the aviation world for certain. It's also worth saying, though, in aviation, we have regulated now for just culture for over 20 years, and aviation is remarkably safe. And I say that because if you think about what aviation does, we put people into a small metal tube and throw it many thousands of feet up into the air, and we do that millions of times a week. Actually, it's pretty impressive the level of safety that we actually have, and that we do sometimes go entire years without a single fatal commercial air transport accident. That's pretty remarkable. And just culture has been an enormous part of how we do that. It is not, however, a no-blame culture, which sometimes people confuse it with. They think if we just don't blame anybody for anything, then they'll tell us all the information and they'll all behave better. Well, not quite, and we'll explore that as well this evening. So how traditionally is safety managed? Well, many of you may have seen this game, typically called whack-a-mole. The little mole pops up, you have a hammer, you hit the hammer, and that mole goes down. That's like blame. The problem of doing that, of course, is another mole appears somewhere else, and shortly later, the same mole will reappear. What this really looks like is you have some kind of event. You decide the event is caused by a human, find who that human was, punish them. Problem over. And I wonder, perhaps in the chat, in the Q&A, if any of you are brave enough to talk about how that relates to your organization. Is that still what you are seeing in your organization, or have we moved on? And so if anybody wishes to comment, I'd be really interested, and perhaps we might even explore one or two. So you've often heard this phrase, the is human. I've talked a little bit about the limitation of the human. Let's perhaps just explore that a little bit further. And I like these two pictures because if you read what's written on the trucks, it makes it quite amusing. The one on the left there On the road to success, there are no shortcuts. Well, this driver appears to have found a shortcut, but it doesn't appear to have been very successful. And the one on the right, it says we fit on the back of the truck. Well, clearly they don't fit. Now, these are not isolated photos. Trucks going under bridges that are too low is a frequent occurrence. It is extremely unlikely that these truck drivers were driving along, saw a low bridge, and thought to themselves, I'm probably not going to fit into this, but I'll put my foot down and I'll have a go, see if we do. It's very unlikely they did that. What is more likely is there was problems in the road signage. I can't see in either of those bridges very clear signage about how tall those bridges are. They may or may not have known exactly how tall their own trucks are. Their route planning was clearly flawed. There could be a number of reasons why they found themselves in that position. Blaming the drivers, unless they did in fact go, I don't think I'm going to fit, I'll have a go anyway. But otherwise, you need to look at your systems that put them there in the first place. So it's human. And we all do it all the time. I'm sure you can all think in your everyday lives when you make a small error. We have an academy here in the UK. And for some reasons, when it was built, the door, which is a push door, the entrance door, has a handle on it. Nearly everybody that comes to the building grabs hold of that handle and pulls. And they pull with all their might. And after a couple of minutes, they ring the bell because they can't open the door. It's a push door. Now, you could say, why don't I fix that and change the handle to a push? Well, it's a really good opener for a conversation when people come for a human factors course, because they've already made an error before they even start the course. So we've left it as it is. But I'm sure you've all seen examples like that, pushing and pulling the wrong door, going the wrong way when you're driving, etc., etc. So why don't we just blame people? Well, blame has some really attractive qualities. It is enormously emotionally satisfying. We all as humans, we really like blame. We really like to say, that went wrong, they did that, that's their fault. The reasons we really like that is, well, it makes the problem go away quickly. I've done something, I've blamed somebody. It, of course, redirects attention away from an individual. It was them, not me. I wouldn't have done that. It can appease corporate guilt. So this is an interesting one that we are seeing playing out on the world stage at the moment, where organizations sometimes will try and blame an individual to be able to say that actually it wasn't the organization's fault. The problem is the legal system these days is really alive to this and understands that people rarely act alone. They usually act based on the culture that they are operating in. Excuse me. This one is very, very powerful, though. It does calm public outrage and often driven by the media. So for an example, here in the UK, I'm quite involved in the air display community. We had a terrible accident some 7 years ago now, where a display aircraft during a maneuver crashed onto a busy road and 11 people lost their lives on that road. Remarkably, the pilot survived. That, of course, has led to a very long legal battle about who is to blame for that accident. And a lot of focus has been put on that, whether that pilot was to blame or not. But of course, the reality is we've been losing an aeroplane a year display flying in the UK since the 1950s. The only difference between this accident and all of the other accidents was, on this occasion, other people got killed. And that's remarkably not the pilot on this case. On all the other occasions, it had just been the pilot that had been killed. And so we rewarded their bravery. But on this occasion, it killed others. That, of course, then, there was public outrage at that. Now, it'd be worth saying that whilst there was a legal case around the pilot, there was also an awful lot of work done around how displays are conducted and risk managed. So actually, we've done the two things in parallel, which I'll explore more, but certainly the public wanted blame. So why not just blame people? If it's so satisfying, why don't we just do it? But it might not be fair. And in that case that I've already talked about, it may not be fair. That pilot was terribly unlucky that he killed people on the ground rather than just himself. That's not necessarily fair. And all the accidents that went before him. Again, each accident has its own set of circumstances. This one most certainly happens is if you do blame people all the time for errors, they will not tell you the things that cause their errors. So you will be blind to the challenges that people face in an organization because they won't report it. They will also start to cover their tracks. So I've seen this happen in an organization that I've been quite close to in the finance side of the organization, where an individual made an error in invoicing one of their largest clients, and it was a substantial invoice. Now, unfortunately, at the time in that organization, they had a culture of blame. It wasn't actually the CEO's intent to, but he hadn't positively influenced the culture away from that. So the individual, having made an error and having had no malicious intent whatsoever or any personal gain out of the error, covered their tracks. They continued to do that for 10 years. Now, bearing in mind this was a listed company that was audited every year, that was never discovered until 10 years later, by which point the covering of their tracks had escalated to the point that it was equivalent really to an overstating of profits by an entire year's profit. As you can imagine, enormously damaging to the share price. That happened because inadvertently, the organization, certainly in the finance team at that point, unwittingly had a blame culture. Of course, if we blame, you're brushing the underlying reasons under the carpet, which is to say, you're not dealing with the root cause. If we think back to those events earlier on, with the patient and the two syringes being identical, as all the focus on blame, nobody was looking into, why don't we make the syringes different? And of course, blame does nothing to prevent the same error happening again. Even if you remove that individual from the organization, if they've made an error, then it is highly likely that someone else will make exactly the same error. So removing the individual won't stop it happening again. It also gives this false sense of security. We've done something, we've blamed somebody, but for those who are responsible managers, you haven't actually solved the issue, but you might believe you have, and then a year later wonder why the same thing happens again. If we treat staff unfairly, of course, that could lead to industrial problems, tribunals, compensation claims, and certainly here in the UK, we've seen a number of those across various industries. And again, blame. You may have heard of the fight or flight reaction that we have as humans. For any of you who have read The Chimp Paradox by Professor Steve Peters, he really explores that more in depth and the science behind that. And if you've not read that book, I actually really recommend that book to you. But that really talks about how our initial response to things is an emotional response. It is, as Steve Peters would call it, our chimps react first. And our chimps don't reason very well. But we don't want no blame. We've already said that. So why not? Well, the reckless actions of a small minority endanger the safety of the whole system. They endanger their colleagues. If it goes unpunished, it can be very corrosive to morale. So I've seen this in another organization where someone did something that was indeed reckless and everyone in the organization knew it. They weren't punished. And that meant that the staff lost trust in their leadership to deal with things. So it goes both ways, trust. And really, that's what we just talked about. Okay, let's revisit our earlier instances, because it's not all bad news in these cases. So particular case around the medical and the syringes, over a number of years, it has got the health profession to understand that actually just culture can make a difference. And it certainly has here in the UK, and they're doing a lot of work. There's a lot to still be done to change the culture. But actually on the international stage now, one of the UK MPs who was head of the health service at the time has gone to the Global Health Service and said, we need to change. We need to think about moving away from blame. And that, of course, needs a change in the way in which the legislative system approaches it. But it is at least starting the conversation that blame is causing people to lose their lives. And back to the United Airlines incident, it was actually a turning point for aviation, not for the captain and the crew involved, unfortunately, but it was the point at which aviation really understood that it needed to recognize the limitations of humans and to systematically protect the system, whilst acknowledging they needed humans to manage the systems. And so, for example, in this case, we talked about having fuel warnings when you get to certain fuel levels. It seems obvious now, it wasn't then. Then it was just a case of, well, it's all the crew's responsibility. And if they don't look at it, we'll blame them. Well, we can now see that actually you can intervene. And if a crew are distracted by something, they will miss things. So it really changed aviation. And as I say, just culture has been legislated for now globally for a number of decades. So let's have a look at this video. So what you saw there was an aircraft a few years ago, an Airbus aircraft, getting airborne and the engine cowlings coming off. Now, why do engine cowlings come off? Well, they weren't done up. The only people that ever undo engine cowlings are aircraft engineers. You have to be qualified to do it, but they are quite simple latches. And in this particular case, they had been unlatched. The engineers hadn't latched them back up, and indeed, nor had the pilots noticed they were unlatched. So, simple case of blame the engineers, blame the pilots, problem goes away. Except the problem doesn't go away. That particular event of Airbus engine cowlings coming open in flight because they weren't done up, to our knowledge, has happened at least 45 times. And there's some photos here. The one in the middle, the British Airways flight, we came very close to that aircraft crashing into the middle of London. That may sound a little sensational, but actually, as the engine cowlings went, they caused all sorts of damage to the engine and an engine fire in one of the engines. So this was quite serious, and blaming people wasn't working. So how are you going to fix it? Well, the challenge here was that the engine cowlings, when they're not locked shut, they do look closed. And actually, the latches that locked them were really small and actually really difficult to see. If we take the BA example, it's a really good example of how a chain of events can lead to an accident. So the engineers are working on the aircraft, they've opened the cowlings. They then get called away to go and work on another aircraft because they're told that's a higher priority. So they go and do that other job. So we have stopped a job halfway through a job, which really in human performance terms is a bit of a no-no. But we've gone away, and actually these engineers were very diligent. They went back to that aircraft to finish the job. The problem was it was now nighttime, and actually it had been a very long day, and they were beginning to suffer from fatigue. But the real issue here was, whilst they'd been away, they'd moved aeroplanes around. So when they went back to their aircraft on the same stand, it actually was a different aeroplane. It had been swapped. They didn't notice that the tail number had changed. What they did notice was that the engine cowlings were closed. So they then assumed that obviously one of their other colleagues had come along, finished the job, and closed the cowlings. So they left the aircraft. But of course, now we know there was an aircraft somewhere on the airfield, but its engine cowlings not done up. But the last line of defense is the pilots doing their walk round check. As I already said, it's incredibly difficult to see. And when they came around to do their walk round, when it was raining and dark, they also missed it. And that's just one event of these at least 45 events. So how do we change this? Do we tell people, be more careful? Well, clearly that doesn't work. What we needed to do was redesign how those cowlings close so that if they're not locked shut, they're very obviously open, and to make the latches much more visible. And that's what they've done. And to my knowledge, we've not had another event since. So we could have carried on blaming. If we'd have carried on blaming, we'd have had another 45 of those events by now, but we didn't. We stopped blaming and said, actually, we need to change the design of this aircraft so that it's human proof. And that's what we've done. I just want to talk about, we keep using this word error, but actually error covers a broad range of things. A true error is an action that you do, but it's not intended. It's an unintentional act. For example, you miss a speed limit sign because you're busy or there's a distraction and you don't see that the speed limit has changed. That's now an error. You're still speeding, but the reason you're speeding is because you made an error. You didn't mean to be speeding. Clearly, in this particular location here in the UK, that must have been a very common occurrence. So someone has painted a very large speed sign. Doesn't really help if you're distracted. The important thing to make is that we all make errors, and it doesn't matter how experienced you are, we still make errors. It's part of being human. And an error is not in itself a cause. I often hear in investigations, the cause of this accident was human error. No, human error is a symptom of something that has caused the human error, or a system isn't designed well enough around the human. Because people can't avoid things they didn't intend to do. It's no good telling them be more careful. You can't change the human, you can change the conditions they work in. Sometimes people make mistakes. Now, I don't want to get too drawn on the difference between an error and a mistake, but a mistake is subtly different in that people do need to take the action, but it's the wrong course of action, usually because of a lack of knowledge of something. Here's another example from here in the UK. Most people I ask in the UK, what's the speed limit on this road? They'll say 70 miles an hour because it's a dual carriageway. Actually, it's not, it's 60 because it's only a dual carriageway if there's a physical barrier down the middle. I didn't know that until I started teaching this course. So sometimes people have a gap in their knowledge. Often in organizations, there are ways of doing things that aren't actually in accordance with the procedures, but that's what others have been taught. So people don't even know that they're making a mistake. But sometimes people break rules and they know they're breaking rules. Usually, they don't intend anything bad to happen. And as I've already said, usually they do it because they think that's what their boss wants them to do. But they are, of course, a significant threat to our safety or to our systems. Of course, many of you in risk management, it is not about operational safety. It might be about financial controls, for example. And as we've already talked about, violations are very much a function of culture. I mentioned that culture that I was in, where we violated rules all the time, and we were really proud of it. I now look back and realize that was a cultural error, and that culture needed to be led in a different direction. Sometimes, though, we do see reckless acts. For example, in aviation, pilots turning up with alcohol in their bloodstream is considered reckless. We all know that alcohol degrades performance, and so it shouldn't have it anywhere near an airplane. Sometimes people, for all sorts of reasons, deliberately sabotage. In this particular aircraft type, it was part of the manufacturing process. An employee was very disgruntled and was deliberately doing damage to aircraft. These situations are rare. People do reckless or sabotage acts, but they do occasionally happen. They do need to be dealt with. So how are we going to deal with these things and make sure we're consistent? Because when we're talking about changing a culture, we must be consistent. Otherwise, you can get it right 100 times, get it wrong one time, and everyone remembers that, where we blame inappropriately. So at Bain Simmons, we have a system to help people do this. It's free. It's available on our website. I promise I'm not trying to sell you anything here. And within that system, and I'm just going to show you a couple of pages, we talk about this process. Something has happened or people have seen something. You need to triage that. How much effort am I going to put into investigating it? Do I need to do something immediately to contain it? But then carry out an investigation. And then what we advocate is following that investigation, that it's independently reviewed. And it's independently reviewed against a behavioural flowchart. Now, there are several of these. This is obviously ours. This has got 20 years of industry experience in it, based on academia originally, but also on the real world experience. And we work through this flowchart. And actually, this comes out with what behaviours an individual has actually demonstrated. Have they made an error, mistake? Have they been reckless or committed sabotage? In which case, you're probably handing it over to the authorities. Have they broken rules? And if so, why have they broken the rules? Is it for personal gain? Then blame comes to play. It's the only solution to that. But is it because that's what they think their boss wants? Is it for organizational gain to do things quicker and cut corners? Or is it actually because the procedures aren't workable in the first place? They don't have the tools or well-written procedures to do the thing properly first time. That's what a good investigation should look at. And again, in those cases, blaming doesn't fix the problem. We need to fix the procedures. We then take the results of that and we ask some questions. Would somebody else have done something the same? Has it happened before to the organization or to the individual? And all of that will determine what is the appropriate intervention. How are we going to stop this happening again? Sometimes that might be blame. More often than not, it is fixing something in the system and leading the correct culture of how you as leaders in organizations want things to be done in the first place, and to make sure that we are measuring and encouraging the right behaviors to begin with. That is it from me. I will summarize by saying, if you feel that you would like to make a risk improvement program, which can be numerous things, and you know, the IRSN and us at Bain Simmons, we are very aligned in our thinking that risk is a holistic thing. There are many facets to risk. It is not just a risk register in a boardroom, but actually it includes the behaviors and culture in an organization. And I commend to you all that if you haven't already looked at how just is our organization, how well are we determining the right interventions following an event, and how well are we encouraging our staff to report the things that happen so that we can look for solutions that are human proof before we have a serious output failure. And I would commend that you give just culture a serious consideration. It has made a massive difference in the aviation industry, and it's been regulated for now for a number of years. Okay, I will fire it open to any questions, any thoughts, challenges.
We haven't had any questions in yet. If anybody would like to ask Ian a question, you can either raise your virtual hand and we can unmute you to ask a question, or you can use the Q&A or the chat box. Lee, do you have any questions for Ian whilst we're waiting for the audience to ask any questions?
Actually, I've been listening, through intently now. It's been a very good presentation, and I thank you for that, Ian. And again, a lot of the things you've touched on is how we drive the system and how we communicate the health and safety systems and the risk systems throughout the organization. So a lot of it just touched on things that, refreshed on that. So thank you for that. But for questions, no, I'm still digesting as you've gone through. I normally don't like watching videos on flying before I go home, because we fly a lot.
Yeah, but I would say people often ask me that. I head up an organization that's primarily concerned with aviation safety, although we do go into lots of other industries. And they say, well, does that mean aviation isn't safe? No, it means that we work every day really, really hard to keep it safe. And that, of course, is the same of all organizations. But what we do recognize is that a huge part of that for a leadership team is to manage the culture, know what culture you want, manage that culture and measure it, because what gets measured gets done. And that's the behaviors, and that will have an enormous impact on the risk profile of an organization. But yeah, flying is quite remarkably safe. I always say to people, actually, if you are going flying, then it is most likely statistically that the flight is the safest part of your day. The journey to the airport, both in cars, vehicles, or crossing the road to get into the airport, is much more statistically risky than the flight.
Yeah, always the amount of accidents you see on motorways and roads and car parks, you're probably spot on there. We don't seem to have any more questions. Are there any closing thoughts you can leave us with, Ian, before we end tonight's webinar?
I think it's to re-emphasize that risk sometimes can get a bit centric around risk matrices and reporting things in boardrooms, and that's important, because it's important for boardrooms to be able to make resourcing decisions. But risk happens at the front line of your organization, whatever business you are involved in, and the culture at your front line will be critical to the risk profile of the business. And if you have an organization that deals with everything with blame at all different levels in the organization, then you will be carrying an awful lot more risk in that organization than you actually need to be. What I will say, though, is depending on your starting point, driving a cultural change program, it's not easy. I'm not going to sit and pretend it is. It isn't a case of just, taking a behavior chart like our FAIR system. It does need leadership to really engage in it and really engage in stuff, but the benefits are enormous. And those benefits, depending on your organization, will flow to the bottom line, because they will create a more efficient organization. They will create an organization that gets it right first time more often. And when it recognizes problems, fixes it before it has output failures. So I do commend, if you haven't already thought about how do you instill a safety culture built around a just culture in your organization, then I commend to you to explore what that might look like, because it is probably the single biggest difference you can make to the risk profile of your organization without changing the environment that you operate in.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you, Ian. And thank you so much for giving up your valuable time, and apologies, the technology failed us this time last month. So I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for attending this evening. Just to remind you that the recording will be uploaded onto the RRSM YouTube channel in the next day or two, and we hope to see you at the next Saudi Arabia branch webinar on the 18th of July at 6:30 p.m. local time. So good night, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Good night.